Hello. I was going to talk a bit about um, dissociative identity disorder and about the idea that people have consciously created their alters. I feel that there are definitely two groups in the DID world. There's many groups, but there's people with borderline, for example, who may also have DID, and there's people with DID who don't have borderline. So it's very common in people with borderline to constantly try out different roles to work out who their core self is. And in that process, if they are also dealing with abuse, they can create many different selves that help them deal with abuse through their skills of trying out different roles. But someone who has DID and doesn't have borderline may not have those same skills of simply trying out, constantly trying out new roles, or especially not driven to do so because of a lack of self. And so there's an assumption that that all people with DID will have somehow been highly imaginative and consciously created their alters. In my case, my alters go back to at least 2 years old, and as the core self, there appears to be signs in my photos that I was certainly mostly dissociated by 2 to 4 years old, and I stopped being able to really run the body or present in the body from after 4 years old. And though I have been the observer and historian for my system, so what that means is that I'm aware of when the others knew about each other and whether or not they had any processes of creating each other. And certainly I have no memory of having created any of them. Pretty much I kind of went to sleep or was staring into space and lost connection with the body and didn't develop connection with the voice, and I stopped having conscious awareness of personal thought or any of that. So it's, if I have been a creator of my alters, then I've done it in a pre-conscious or unconscious state. However, there was certainly one of the alters who was aware of at least 2 of the others, and that was Polly. So when Polly was 2, she was under the bed, and at night to protect from what had been quite ritualized abuse, and terrified under the bed, she had sensed a ghost in the room that she felt was Willie, as she called Willie in years to come. And she was so frightened of this ghost, but so frightened of abuse, that she let this ghost become part of her, and so she felt she'd left the body. So basically she was aware of the experience of an alter being outside of her, and of having split. And that's not the same as some child who is indulging the creativity and imagination of a special private little world under a bed. If you're hiding from abusers who come in and choke you and suffocate you in the night, it's not really a fabulous celebration of the skills of imagination. And I find it really incredibly insulting that people project onto those situations that the person experiencing it has made their alters up, that they had some luxury of imagination to do so. And but later, Polly experienced another of the alters, which she saw in the mirror, and she saw this girl as Carol, who wasn't behaving like her. So basically, she made sense of it by believing that this other girl had somehow got into the mirror. So she was 4, but she was seeing an alter presenting in her body and not understanding it and being co-present, which is where the two people are still present at the same time. Her way to make sense of it wasn't that she had become this other girl, but the other girl was in the mirror. And that's not the same, again, as someone having had the luxury of imagination. Carol emerged from a part of the self being turned into a puppet and being put through things as an object, as a doll. So without being too descriptive about that, I think you can understand it's not the same as some happy little imaginative child who decides to make an imaginary friend in the mirror. Dissociation was already going on, and Polly was able to be aware of at least the presence of 2 other alters. And the others didn't become aware of each other, and there's 8 alters and me as the core self. So they didn't have the same processes as Polly. There was one called Da who remembered seeing like a ghost girl outside of the body when she was in the school ground. Da was in the school ground, who then was a he. And but Da didn't know this was Polly, and recently was disclosing about having had this ghost friend who she thought of as Mary's little lamb that had followed her to school. And she was basically experiencing an out-of-body, a sort of co-conscious out-of-body thing with Polly, but Polly was the one outside of the body at the time, this time, instead of it being Polly in the body experiencing another alter. But still, Da didn't know who that was until I was back present in the body and recognized it from Da's memory and said that was actually Polly. So who you were perceiving outside of you. And so I think I get, I really wanted to explain there's a big difference between people who are creating roles and then get lost about which one is themselves versus the process of splitting. And that the process of splitting does not necessarily mean this is part of having imaginary friends or being extremely imaginative, and that if you understand the circumstances where the splitting began, it's really insulting to project that luxury onto the children who are going through those things. The other difference is there are people with DID whose alters are much more like roles. So they might have a self which is their angry self, or their sad self, or their working self, or their learning self, or a child self, and these might be fairly two-dimensional because they are roles. And the difference between that and when alters are more developed than roles is, for example, with someone like Da, you could try to say, well, Da's the comedian, but Da's also the entrepreneur. Da is also a systematician. Da is also a troubleshooter. You could say Da's all about joking and being physical and, you know, having fun, but Da is also the strategist, the person who can escape extreme violence. You can look at someone like Willie and say, oh, well, that part is just the intellectual, or just the learning one, but or just the learning working one or something. But Willie has very strong humanitarian principles. Willie has a deep a lot of very strong feelings about justice, and has interests in likes classical music, is interested in things far outside of some fairly two-dimensional role. And how this happens is that instead of my selves developing from experimentation with roles, what mine did was they took chunks of what would have been my identity, and instead of taking one chunk, they would take kind of handfuls, and these developed as whole identities that were perhaps not as whole as sort of singleton people would have one identity, but in other ways they functioned like whole people, where people with DID who have selves who are basically this role or this role or this role, those come out specifically much more for this task or this person, rather than having abilities across a wider range of tasks or social communication situations or people. So I hope that helps understand the difference. So there are people with borderline, and there's people with DID, and some people with borderline will develop DID because of the abuse they've been through, and many people with borderline will not have DID. And there will be people with DID who don't have borderline. And there are people with DID who have come from backgrounds of developmental disabilities because that group may be more prone to abuse than many populations. It's also the case that children who are abused from very early are more likely to have things like brain injury that can contribute to issues like developmental disabilities. So there's some overlap, and I think we need to be mature about that and not wrestle too much with the purism about it, and also still understand that it will have some significant differences what kind of situation you're from when you are a person with DID. Communication. Thank you for listening. Bye.